The Crystal Swan. Chapter 1. The Thinnest of Thin Air. Eve stood motionless and gazed through the window of the dusty old antique shop. During her 2-week holiday in Malin-Beg, she had walked past this shop nearly every day and been fascinated by the curiosities that seemed to whisper out at her, which is precisely what curiosities do to curious people. But she'd never been in. This place seemed like the kind of place that children were not allowed to enter. If by some unusual twist or turn she was allowed through that bright red cottagey door with her parents, she expected that there would be lots of shushing and tutting and don't touch anything, especially if Vincent, her mischievous younger brother, was in tow, as he was absolutely expert at finding trouble wherever it was to be found, and where there was none to be found, he was equally expert at simply creating that trouble out of the thinnest of thin air. To her surprise, on this particular day, a Friday in late August, the last full day of their holiday, Eve's mum pushed the door open and said, "Come on, you lot, let's see what mysteries can be found in here." They filed in one by one. Even Vincent seemed momentarily hushed by the sense of history that hung in the air. Whether it was a sense of history or just cobwebs and dust, Eve wasn't sure. Not immediately, anyway. Once inside, and after the customary wiping of feet, Eve's dad took her hand gently and set off in the direction of the back of the shop. Slowly enough and surely enough, they drifted past shelves and shelves of novelties and peculiarities, each of which Eve was certain had a story to tell. "Some of these things must be hundreds of years old," her dad whispered, quietly enough so as not to offend any of the antiques that might have had their ears pricked up, but loudly enough for Eve's ears to hear. While Eve probably heard his words, she wasn't really listening, as she had become thoroughly enchanted by her surroundings. Even the sensation of her dad's hand wrapped around hers was numbed, as her fabulously creative mind was in flight, winging her away to the farthest off of the far-off places in the geography of her imagination. "Come through here," her dad urged. "These clocks look ancient." He loosed her hand and walked over to inspect some particularly unusual-looking cuckoo clocks. The workmanship, he said to himself, fascinated with the business of being fascinated. But hey-ho, in a surprised and not at all weary way, Eve's attention was elsewhere. Something had presented itself to her as most peculiar, an altogether out-of-place artifact, even in this decidedly peculiar place. She wondered to herself if it was even on display, or if perhaps the owner of the shop had just left something of his own from his own house on a shelf. It looked too clean, and it certainly didn't look like it belonged in the room of curious clocks. The Crystal Swan that commanded her gaze was about the size of an apple. Compulsion compelled, as is the way with compulsion, for Eve to reach out and pick it up, just to feel its coldness in her hand, or both of her hands, and to feel its weight. At about that moment, for the historical record, when the untidy strands of her contemplations were evolving into a conclusion, the most startling and unexpected thing happened. The unexpected happening would be remembered by Eve for as long as she continued to make new memories and remember the ones that had already been remembered, as the very moment that her life was thrown into colour. For colour was the happening, the room around her lit up with the most vivid display of colour and light, the likes of which she had never before witnessed. Broad beams of powerful colour were spun about the room through the swirling antique shop dust, bouncing off and painting as it did all of the surfaces of the room. The original place of all of this colourful light was absolutely unmistakable. Without any flavour of a doubt, all of this light was coming from the enchanting Crystal Swan. More than slightly taken aback, more than just a little startled, Eve turned around to look at her dad for his reaction. But he didn't seem to react at all. He didn't even seem to notice, like the colourful lights didn't even exist. "Dad!" exclaimed Eve. Just as Eve had called to her dad Something else happened to jolt her rudely out of the moment. This time her dad was startled too, and then annoyed. Crash! The loudest and most unnerving noise came barnstorming into the room of curious clocks, and both Eve and her dad knew exactly what had caused it. Vincent. That evening at the hotel, more of a guest house really, as they packed their suitcases for home, Eve could not stop wondering about the Crystal Swan and the magical colourful lights that had filled the back room of the old antique shop. She wondered, in a less than meandering way, about the curious fact that her dad, who was ordinarily eagle-eyed, like an eagle, did not seem to see the display of bright and colourful lights. How could he have missed them? Then she wondered about the unusual reaction of the antique shop owner to the destruction that Vincent had caused by knocking a large turtle shell off a cabinet and through a glass display case. He just laughed. He was a kindly-looking man about the same age as her dad, or maybe a few years older, and he just laughed. Until Vincent had bellowed, "It wasn't me," which was his usual and trusty defence, they hadn't even noticed that there was a shop owner at all, and that the shop owner had been standing in the corner all along. Neither Eve nor Vincent, especially Vincent, were used to adults reacting in that way when accidents happened or things got broken. The shop person had just let off a deep and honest laugh that came all the way up from his feet, up through his generous barrel chest, and erupted from his face, shaking the room. Eve's mum immediately picked Vincent up forcefully. "I told you not to touch anything," she said sternly, in a most dramatic, calculated and serious display of seriousness. But Vincent could not hear his mother's voice. Instead, the roar of belly laughter had set him off, and he started laughing himself. Vincent loved to laugh. "Vincent!" His mother was getting angrier now. "This is not funny. You were told not to touch anything." "We're awfully sorry," she said apologetically to the shop owner. "There's nothing so valuable as a good laugh in this place." His voice was still soaking wet with that laughter. So Vincent continued, as did the man. For the next 10 minutes, even Vincent's mum and dad had continued to apologise. The shop owner had continued to reassure them that they had nothing to apologise for, and Vincent continued to laugh. Now, as if this whole encounter had not already been fascinating enough, when the laughing man introduced his name into the conversation, there was a dawning of a new intrigue. He was called Mr. Coll, which wasn't the intriguing part. It was his first name that Eve thought peculiar. He introduced himself as Turtle Coll. That name made both Eve and Vincent smile broadly. How gleeful, Eve thought, it must be to be named after an animal. She pondered, however briefly, why it was that more people were not named after animals. As for the damage, as for compensation or apology, Mr. Coll would have none of it. Instead, he insisted that the family visit him one more time the following morning before they made their way back out of town, up the road, to catch the ferry home. On the way out of the door, Mr. Coll smiled at Eve and winked, except that even his wink seemed unusual, because he winked with both eyes at the same time, which I suppose is technically a blink. Curious altogether, thought Eve. Chapter 2. Another Turtle Coll. The next morning, with the car all packed up and ready for the drive to Belfast, the Coyles walked the 100 or so metres down Main Street to keep their appointment at the antique shop. When they arrived and walked through the door, Eve was surprised and then disappointed to see that there was a different person standing behind the counter awaiting their arrival. Eve wondered if the turtle man, as she had taken to calling him with the earthquake laughter, had forgotten that they had agreed to return to meet with him. "And so, I've been waiting for yous," rang a heavy and deep, but not unfamiliar voice. The stranger in the shop on this morning was older, maybe 30 years older, than the man that had greeted them the day before. But as Eve looked at his face, deep into his white bearded face, she couldn't help but think that it wasn't just his voice that seemed familiar. "Let me shake the hand of the wee fella that awoke that turtle from its slumber." Vincent extended his little arm and his little hand, which was attached to the end of his little arm, even before the man had finished his sentence. "Ha ha 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 ha!" He shook the room with his laughter and shook Vincent's hand in both of his bear-like paws. "Turtle," he said. "People call me Turtle. And the wee lady." He paused and looked semi-serious for the fleetiest of fleeting moments. "You must be Eve." His address carried a respectful tone, almost as though he was greeting royalty. He extended his hand in her direction and smiled at her broadly, looking straight into her eyes. She blushed and shook his hand. "You're the reason that you've all been asked to come back here today, young'un." This surprised Eve. "What, me?" she said in disbelief. "Yes, you," he exclaimed, his smile getting even broader. "You left something behind yesterday, something that belongs to you, something that's been waiting here for you for some time. Who even knows how long?" He smiled up at Eve's mum and dad now, before returning his attention to the blushing girl, whose hand he still held in his. "It would seem that more than just the old turtle was awoken yesterday." With this, he lifted his free hand from his pocket, where it had dived just a moment earlier, and placed it on top of the smooth, polished wooden counter. When he opened it, he revealed a deep red velvet cloth in his palm, which seemed to be wrapped around something that was about the size of an apple. Eve knew instinctively what was wrapped up inside that crushed velvet cloth. "The swan," he said, confirming Eve's suspicions and flightiest wishes. "This belongs to you. Or you belong to it. I never quite understood which it is." Eve had spent 2 weeks in that part of Ireland, listening to people speak in poetic riddles, so that she almost, but didn't quite understand. Right at this moment, though, she only heard the words, "The swan, this belongs to you." These words she understood, and her heart sang loudly the songs of delight. "This is too generous," said Eve's mother, reaching for her purse from inside her bag. She understood the meaning of the look on Eve's face and felt sure that there was no price that she would not pay to the shopman to keep that smile exactly where it was. "No, there is no amount of any kind of money that you could exchange for this Crystal Swan, and no way that I would be able to stand in the way of her will. The swan's, that is. She goes where she chooses. Now, let me tell you what I know about this here thing. Come with me and have a piece of cake." Even Vincent had never seen a cake as big as the one that the shop person put down on the table in front of them. The table seemed to creak and groan under its weight. It was clearly freshly baked, as Eve could feel the heat from the cake warm against her face. It smelled of lemons and vanilla and altogether deliciousness. As the elderly-ish man cut through the cake, holding the sharp knife in his big round fist, he broke the silence, in the way that a storyteller breaks the silence at the start of a mysterious but true story. Solemnly, you might say. He laid a wedge of cake as thick as a dictionary in front of Eve and said, "Cacamillish, yum yum," which nobody but him understood, but which everybody kind of understood. "That swan has been in my family for hundreds of years, I think. Well, it's been in and out of the family, as it chooses, for hundreds of years. We're not altogether sure how long, but we are sure that it was already ancient, when it chose to be part of the Coll family. "When I heard that your name was Coil," he said, sweeping his eyes across the faces of the whole family, "I was hardly surprised that she'd chosen to be with you. Don't you know that your name and my name come from the same place? It's a Donegal name. Your family, like my family, must come from these parts." Eve's dad nodded. "Yes," he said, "my family are from Donegal." "They are, of course they are," replied the elder Mr. Coll. "The name means son of the follower of St. Comgaill, who was one of the first Irish saints. He helped spread Christianity throughout Ireland in the 6th century, less than 100 years after St. Patrick himself. That makes us a special people indeed." "Do you know the significance of the swan in these parts, or across the Celtic world in general, but particularly in these parts?" Eve's mum and dad shook their heads slowly, but obviously interested now. Vincent had his chin resting heavily in his hands. He, too, was listening intently. It was unlike him to keep his attention fixed on anything for more than a couple of minutes. It seems as if the deep rhythmic sound of the old man's voice mollified and held Vincent captive. "Well, the swan is very significant around here. Swans signify gods in Celtic mythology, and if you know anything about anything, or anything about mythology, you'll know that all myths are spun from a golden thread of truth. Many of the Celtic gods, for there are many, took on the form of swans. So whenever you see a swan, certainly in Ireland, certainly in these parts, then there's a very good chance that you are looking at the earthly form of one of our powerful gods or goddesses. Now, we don't know exactly which one of those swans, which one of those divine beings that this bit of living crystal here represents, but there is power wrapped up inside this velvet cloth, which you will discover for yourself. I didn't believe in the stories that I was told about the Crystal Swan when I was a boy, but I do know this, and I know it to be a fact. In 1939, this swan left Ireland in the bag of turtle coal for America." "Turtle coal?" Eve's mum questioned. "Ha ha ha," replied Mr. Coll. "You'll find that Turtle is a family name of ours. Ever since the middle of the 18th century, every generation has had at least one turtle. This particular turtle was called John Turtle Coll, and he left for America in the 1930s, just as the Second World War was taking hold. He took this swan with him, and we thought, my family that is, that it would never be seen again." "How did it land back here on these shores?" I imagine you'd be wanting to ask. Well, we just don't know. We do know that John didn't bring it home, because he died about 10 years ago. But what we do know is this. Yesterday, when you arrived in the shop, there she was, standing plain as day on top of the exact piece of red velvet cloth that she left these shores wearing nearly 80 years ago. Like I said, it's been in and out of our lives for a long, long time. Eve's mum and dad exchanged a smile that they felt was a knowing smile, but the reality of the matter was that their smile didn't know anything, or what it felt it knew it was mistaken about. Eve beamed up at the elder Mr. Turtle Coll and instinctively reached out her left hand and then her right hand. As she wrapped her hands around the thing of focused attention, she closed both of her eyes for a second or two. After that, Mr. Coll did not say a whole lot more. He just sat there and ate cake, enormous amounts of cake, and drank tea, enormous amounts of tea. From moment to moment, without any warning, he would burst out into a low, rumbling chorus of laughter, as if he was remembering an old joke or some happy moment from a lifetime ago. And then, as if they were on exactly the same wavelength, Vincent would laugh along, although Eve was not sure that Vincent even knew why he was laughing. As if to wake them all out of their shared but also individual moment, the room full of curious clocks in the next room over started to chime away in the most peculiar chorus, heralding the arrival of the 10th hour of the day. It was time to leave. They all smiled warm and generous smiles towards one another and started their motions towards the door. Eve's mum dropped an address card on the counter as she walked past it, as was her custom, and turned to thank Mr. Coll again. He gave her a glance as if to say, "There's no need to thank me." As Vincent and Eve walked out of the door, two final unusual and unexplainable things happened. First, Vincent reached out and touched Mr. Coll's beard and said, "You look better with that white beard, Mr. Coll." Loud enough for Eve and Mr. Coll to hear, but not loud enough for his mum and dad to hear. Mr. Coll, who was crouched on one knee at this point to say goodbye to the children, smiled. That's when the second unusual and unexplainable thing happened. He winked at Eve, except that even his wink seemed unusual, because he winked with both eyes at the same time, which I suppose is technically a blink. Chapter 3. Routines Schmoutines. Awakening. Over the next 3 weeks, the Coll family routine returned to normal. The school summer holiday had ended, and for Eve, school and family life took on a familiar pattern. The Crystal Swan had taken pride of place on the top shelf of her bookcase in her bedroom, with all of the books and ornaments having been relegated to lesser positions. As the days and then the weeks went by, Eve started to wonder exactly how much of what had happened was a dream, or at least a trick of her very active imagination. She could easily verify that she had been gifted the magnificent and mysterious Crystal Swan in an old antique shop during their summer holiday in Donegal, but the details after that seemed rather vague and spotty, because the circumstances seemed so unusual. When her parents talked about it, as they did from time to time, they laughed and joked, not in an unkind way, about how peculiar the little shop and the old man were. Indeed, how peculiar both of the men called Turtle were. They had taken to calling them those brilliantly bonkers Colls. What was the indescribable feeling of being in that little shop? Indescribable was what it was. She was enchanted, thoroughly enchanted, even before the appearance of one shopkeeper and then the seemingly unusual actions of another. Then there was the dazzling light display and the whole swan thing. That was still in untidy shape in Eve's mind. But what fueled her imagination the most was the comment that her little brother had made when they were leaving the store, and the wink-blink that she had never ever seen before, but had then seen twice by two different people on 2 different days. "You look better with that white beard." She continued to turn this phrase over and over in her mind. When she had asked Vincent about it, he just shrugged and said, "I dunno," as if he had forgotten all about the episode altogether. But as is often the case with these things, life and routine stepped back into Eve's life, and the average day-to-day spread neatly and completely across her horizon. Except at night, the last thing that she did every night before climbing into bed to go to sleep was to loose the drawstrings atop the red velvet cloth and let them slip over the swan, so that the swan was allowed to stand clear through the night, as if being allowed to breathe, or as if being set free. She had no idea why she did this, or indeed why she left the swan wrapped up in the cloth all day long. It just became a compulsion, as if this was the natural order, or even the will of the swan herself. On the morning of September the 23rd, Eve woke up with the most unusual feeling in her tummy. She didn't feel sick, just peculiar, as if she was excited, but she didn't know what she was excited about. She checked her memories to see if there was something that she was excited about deep down that her waking mind had forgotten or pushed back behind some other memories. Was it her birthday? No, that wasn't for another few weeks. Was there something else that she had been excited about before she went to sleep the night before, which had frozen in her mind when she fell asleep and was now defrosting? There was nothing that she could think of. She just had this knot of unexplained excitement in her stomach. It wasn't unpleasant, just unusual, as there seemed to be no explanation for it at all. She got up and started to organise her morning, which included sitting in front of the piano in her room for 10 minutes, pretending to practice, and getting her bits and bobs ready for school. As she went down the stairs to the first floor where everybody else in the family slept, she asked her brother, "Vincent, is there anything that I should be excited about?" He looked at her with curiosity, not fully understanding the question, but made a tilt at answering it anyway. "Your birthday?" "No," she responded. "It's not that. My birthday is not for another few weeks." "My birthday?" he said, with his eyes lighting up. "No, Vincent, it's not your birthday until next month. And why would I be excited about your birthday anyway? No, it's something else." Eve continued into her mum and dad's room. She could hear that her mum was in the bathroom having a shower, so she went around to her dad's side of the bed, where he was reading the morning news on his mobile telephone. "Dad, is there something that I should be excited about?" Her dad smiled as he looked up from the screen that had been previously absorbing all of his attention. "Good morning, sunshine. What's that?" "Is there something that I should be excited about?" He paused for a moment before his smile widened. "Of course there is, sweetheart. Have you forgotten?" I must have forgotten," Eve said, a little suspiciously. "What is it?" "Well, of course it's school, Eve. That's what you should be excited about. Maybe you've got a test or something." He began to laugh. "Dad!" exclaimed Eve. All of the way through breakfast, and all of the way through school, through playtime, and through the times tables test, all the way back from school to Nana's, and then finally all the way home for dinner, Eve could not shake the feeling that there was something that she should be excited about. But for all of her pondering, for all of her questions that she asked, to all of the people who might have had a clue as to why she should be excited, she could not figure out what it was that was giving her butterflies. At one stage through the day, the butterflies were so tickly that she actually got hiccups. When it came to bedtime that evening, Eve had not managed to figure out the answer to the riddle of why she felt that she should be excited. What she didn't understand at that moment in time is that her body knew what her mind did not yet know, that her life was about to change in the most amazing way, and it would never be the same again. At 7:45 in the evening, Eve put her head on her pillow, ready for sleep. As she lay down, she caught the red velvet cloth out of the corner of her eye. She'd forgotten to let the swan out for the night. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and saw to the task that had become part of her nightly routine. All was well, all was usual. At a few minutes past 8, Eve drifted off to sleep, still with the mild buzz of excitement that had hovered around her all day, expecting as she did so that the next time she opened her eyes, she would be starting her morning routine, ready for school the next day. Almost the moment that she drifted off, or what felt to her like the moment she drifted off, she was awoken. She wasn't sure what had woken her, whether it was a sound or a movement or simply a bit of sleep turbulence. But the moment she opened her eyes, the excited tingle that had been sitting in her stomach stood up and made itself known. And as it did, Eve realised what the feeling had been about all day. The room was filled with light. The very same light that Eve had witnessed some weeks ago in the room of curious clocks in the old antique shop. All the colours of the rainbow were cast about the room, reflecting off every surface. It was dark outside, so there was no lights coming in through the roof window. The light, like last time, was clearly coming from inside of the swan. This was impossible. Eve sat up, unusually not frightened or alarmed at all, but rather curious. The butterflies in her stomach had butterflown away, and now Eve just swiveled her head around the ceiling, following the lights as they moved. She climbed out of bed again, carefully and deliberately, before starting to make her way across to the bookshelf where the swan was sitting, pride of place. The colourful lights danced across her face as she approached. As she got closer and closer, her movements seemed to be less controlled. She seemed drawn in, rather than moving under her own steam. But still, she was not alarmed. Instead, she felt calm and composed, if still rather curious. When she was within touching distance, her right hand moved out towards the swan. Again, she was not really in control of her own motions, but not resisting the movement either. And then she touched the crystal. Without feeling that she had moved at all, or changed her position, she found herself in a different place, or rather in the same place, but with altered surroundings. It took Eve a few moments to realise what had changed, but when she did, she was astounded and filled with wonder. She realised that she was still in her bedroom, but now it seemed she was actually inside the swan itself. From inside the swan, she was now looking out into her bedroom, where before she had been looking into the swan from the outside, from her bedroom. How could this be possible? She thought to herself. She turned around and looked in all directions. She could clearly make out all of the things in her room, including her bed and some of her toys, her rocking horse Jasmine and her wardrobe. She could even see out of the skylight into the midnight blue sky. But what was most evident, what dominated the whole scene, the whole of Eve's bedroom, was the colourful lights. Except they had changed. Before, they had simply been blurred, merged colourful lights that didn't seem to have a distinct line or border from one colour to the next. Now, the colours and lights had sharp edges. But they were more than just lights. To Eve's amazement, as she focused in, now on the lights cast on her bedroom ceiling from inside the swan, she realised that they were actually pictures. There were hundreds or hundreds of distinct and individual pictures. More than that, as she continued to look, she realised that the pictures were moving. Within the distinct frame of each image, there was a scene, as if she was looking at lots and lots of TV screens that were each showing a different picture with no sound. She stood in one spot and looked around for what seemed like a very long time, swept over by a sense of wonderment, not fear or confusion, just wonder. After some time standing there in the darkness, looking outward towards these colourful scenes of distant places, she suddenly felt compelled to look in one direction, and then look at one specific moving image. Her gaze was drawn in on it, as if she was zooming in until this image stood in front of her, as if she was stood at a doorway with the door flung open to the outside. Then, without question or fear, she stepped through. Instantly, she felt that the texture of what lay beneath her feet was different. The ground was that of coarse sand, wet coarse sand. And then the rest of her surroundings rolled out around her, and her senses all became alive at once. Howling wind was blowing droplets of rain in from all directions. It was cold, not winter cold, but late summer or autumn cold, and incredibly damp. The sky above her was a bruised palette of grey and purple. She felt as though she was standing on the edge of a storm, one that was either on its way in or on its way out. It was clearly daytime, although there was no way of knowing whether it was in the morning, afternoon, or even early evening. Eve instinctively felt that it was late in the afternoon. She could not see the sun in the sky. Indeed, the clouds were so heavy that she could not even tell what part of the sky the light was coming from. To Eve's left was the ocean, only about 30 or 40 metres away, and to her right were tall cliffs that didn't seem to offer any let-up either behind her or in front of her, for as far as her eyes could see through the misty rain. Now her nightdress was starting to cling to her as the rain soaked her and the wind whipped up assault after assault. As she scanned behind her, she noticed the doorway that she had come through seemed to have slammed shut, and there was no way to know where she had just come from. In her right hand she held a weight, and she knew what that weight represented without even having to look at it. She was holding the Crystal Swan. She looked up at the sky again and squinted her eyes to shelter them from the rain, and as she looked down again, she noticed something in the middle distance that she had not noticed before. There was a shape lying on the beach down by the advancing water's edge. At first she thought that it might have been a large lump of driftwood, like a tree trunk that had long ago fallen or been cast into the ocean in some faraway place. But as she focused on it, she noticed that it seemed to have clothing wrapped around it. Seemingly, without even commanding her body to move, she started walking, slowly at first, towards the shape at the water's edge. As she got closer, the realization took hold of her that this was a person. There was a person lying on the beach, on this cold and wet beach, at the water's edge facing out into the wild ocean. The sound of waves crashing, which she had not really noticed or paid attention to before, sounded like a thunderstorm with a booming explosion of noise rumbling up the beach and echoing off the cliffs every few seconds. As Eve approached the figure and was within 5 meters or so, she noticed that the person seemed to be breathing. She could see the rain and weather-soaked shirt on the figure's back rising and falling rhythmically. She paused for a moment as she wondered what to do next. But before she had too long to think, the decision was taken out of her hands and her feet began to move again, almost as if she was floating through a dream. She walked around the figure lying on the beach to where the sand was heavier and wetter and stopped to look around at the ocean. It seemed, she figures, that the tide must have been moving out, as the sand was heavier and wetter, but the water was not lapping right up to where her feet were sinking down. Now she turned back to the figure and realized immediately that it was a man. He had quite long brown hair and a wispy beard that was not as full or heavy as her dad's beard, and he seemed to be quite a young man. Eve thought maybe about 20. Without any reservation at all, which surprised her, she leant forward and touched his face, at first gently and then more firmly, as if she was trying to wake him up from his sleep. Why she would want to wake the stranger up, she had no idea, but the part of her that seemed to be controlling her in this dreamlike trance, seemed to have decided that she was not to be frightened of this strange man in this strange place. She straightened up again and stood tall. She looked up and down the cliff face again to see if there was any point at which she might be able to get off this beach, or indeed where the man may have come from. She wondered if perhaps he hadn't been washed ashore. He seemed to be wearing old-fashioned clothes. His shirt was less a shirt and more like one of the blouses that she'd seen the women in the museum wear when they were pretending to be from olden times. The trousers seemed only to go beneath the knee, and looked like they were made out of the potato sacks that her Irish great-aunts seemed to have their potatoes delivered in. Eve encountered upon the strange sensation that she had been here before, or been near here before, and that she was in some way connected to this place, perhaps even to this person. And then this sensation turned into a desperate anxiety, an immediate need to help this man, in whatever way she could, as if some very important things relied upon it, maybe her own existence. Then, unexpectedly, just as the anxiety grew in her mind, she noticed bright, colourful shafts of light bounce off her face and into the sky. So powerful were these shafts of light that they shot up like columns in a temple and reflected against the clouds. She looked down at the object in her hand, to where the lights were coming from and closed her eyes as the radiated heat from the swan became overwhelming. And then there was darkness. Chapter 4. Questions. The Fog of Time. Eve sat bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide open. It was morning. She gathered her thoughts together and patted herself down, expecting her nightdress to be soaking through from the wind and rain that had pummeled her during the night on the beach. She was bone dry. There was no sand between her toes and not even a drop of moisture in her hair. She swiveled her neck around to look at the top shelf of her bookcase. The swan was exactly where it had been the night before when she went to sleep. She looked at the little clock on her bedside table to see what time it was. It was just before 6. Her brother Vincent would be bounding up the staircase any moment now. He was as regular, but not quite as predictable as clockwork. From the moment that Eve opened her eyes, she was absolutely certain of the reality that she was waking from, and that it was just as real as the one that she was waking into. Even though there was absolutely no evidence of such, and even though it defied logic. These were some of the most confusing moments in Eve's life to this point. Eve's imagination had, from time to time, made it difficult for her to distinguish between what was real and what was less than real. She'd had lifelike dreams before, but nothing like this. At the slightest distraction, her mind was prone to wander, let alone when she was asleep, when her thoughts would often tumble into the most colourful and vivid landscapes of the imagination. But usually, when it was simply her imagination, she could recognise the genesis of these thoughts or dreams. The ingredients were built from her own interests and obsessions. Unicorns, mermaids, and other mythical beasts that leapt from the pages of the books that she read into her thoughts. This wasn't that. This was a boring encounter on a dark beach with a person that felt somewhat familiar but that she didn't quite recognise. Two conflicting teams of thoughts jostled for position within her conflicted mind. The first was desperate to validate the journey that she had just been on. It reminded her of the realistic nature of true sights and sounds and other senses. She could not remember feeling sand between her toes before during a dream, or the distinct smell of the ocean. This part of her mind also reminded her of the light show. Not one light show, but now 3. Surely this must be real, however unlikely. The other part of her mind ridiculed the first. What a silly notion, it whispered. A trick of the light must have caused the swan to spin colours all over the antique shop during the first encounter, just as she'd seen a glass prism do in a science lesson at school. And that experience had planted a seed in the fertile soil that was Eve's imagination. While the believer made the stronger case in those early moments, naturally the cynic began to gain a foothold and take over the most prominent narrative as the fog of time descended. For the rest of the day, the 24th of September, Eve's mind was exhausted. She struggled with the simplest tasks at school and at home. She could not hold a single concentrated thought in her mind for long enough for her to make any sense of it. No part of her ever contemplated telling her brother about it, but she did think about talking to her mum, then to her dad. But something told her that they wouldn't take it seriously. At school, she longed to talk to her best friend Kira about the events of the night before. Again, she just felt that the story wouldn't be believed. Kira would always listen intently and would be very interested, but would probably assume that this was just the beginning of another great adventure story created by Eve for their mutual enjoyment. Her mind turned over and over. When she got home from school, she raced up to her room and took the Crystal Swan out of the velvet cloth that she had wrapped it in that morning somewhat reluctantly. She held it in both of her hands and rolled it from one palm to the other, staring deeply as she did into the cut and cultured glass, looking for a clue to her recent experiences. She sat there on her piano stool for all of 10 minutes, gazing vacantly at the object in her hands. After dinner and homework, Eve prepared herself for bed and climbed under the covers a whole hour early, making sure that the swan was free and clearly visible from where she lay in bed. That evening, sleep did not bring the answers that Eve had hoped for. Instead, the exhausting night and day before brought the deepest sleep that she could ever remember having. Chapter 5. The Second Encounter. One day followed the next, and as far as the Crystal Swan was concerned, life seemed pretty uneventful. Days then rolled over into weeks, and so the day of Eve's birthday landed. It was the 13th of October, and once again Eve opened her eyes at about 6 in the morning. She immediately registered at the very front of her thoughts that it was her birthday, and this excitement stood tall and proud without even having to announce itself. But something else registered very quickly, also unannounced, less expected, but not wholly unfamiliar. She had felt this same excitement just a few weeks earlier, then new and fresh. Now she felt she knew exactly what it signified and possibly what it heralded. She looked up at the Crystal Swan, who had faded away a little over recent days behind the veil of everyday happenings. At this moment, even though there was no light display or anything dramatic happening, the swan seemed to loom larger up there in her place on the otherwise unoccupied top shelf of her bookcase. The two excitements were distinct from one another. There was the delight that came along with the expectation that good things were going to happen to her all day long. There would be presents and cards, there would be a tea party and lots of people telling her how special she was, which was her favourite part. Then there was the other, a kind of unique, poised anticipation, more of a curious and mysterious sensation that centred around the top shelf of Eve's bookcase. Now, for the first time in weeks, Eve did not doubt for 1 second that the events of the 23rd of September had been real and not a manifestation of a dream. All doubt washed away in moments. She contemplated sharing this discovery with her parents, but realised how silly it might seem, telling them that she had been whisked away to a faraway place and time, inside the Crystal Swan, to simply observe a man lying on a beach. If this journey had been so real, then why had she not said something sooner? This was a peculiar predicament indeed. Eve was not nervous or frightened of what might happen. She anticipated that she would be drawn up out of sleep again that evening and taken somewhere else, or perhaps to the same place, but she couldn't be certain. Perhaps it wasn't an experience that would befall her only during the evening when she was alone in her bedroom and sleeping. Perhaps she would be whipped away right at that moment. Perhaps she didn't even need to be close to the swan at all. Perhaps she would be swiped away during dinner in front of her parents and her brother. She wouldn't need to convince anybody of anything if that happened. Perhaps she'd just disappear into thin air during the school assembly. That might be interesting. She'd probably become quite famous around Cheadle Catholic and probably much further afield. She suspected, however, very strongly that bedtime might be the time. The events of her birthday stuttered by without Eve taking nearly as much notice as she usually did, so that several people, parents, teachers and friends asked her, "Eve, are you all right?" Or, "Eve, are you away with the fairies again?" When bedtime rolled around, Eve made very little fuss about getting ready for bed. Indeed, she had her toothbrush in her mouth and was pulling on her pyjamas well before her mother had gotten around to suggesting winding down the day. She was keen, a little anxious, to see what lay in store for her beyond the curtain of sleep. Rather unexpectedly, Even though she was inside the grip of excitement, Eve succumbed to sleep the very moment her head hit the pillow. Almost. And then, completely expectedly, what felt like immediately, Eve's eyes were open again and the room was filled with familiar, colourful lights. This time seemed different. This time, Eve was more in control of her movement. She didn't feel like she was gliding across the room involuntarily, like she did last time. Instead, she made willing and deliberate movements, footstepping right foot after left. It was almost as though the Crystal Swan had been compelled to show her the way the first time around, but was now able to let her get there willingly. And when the moment came, and she moved from the outside to the in, she felt as though she made that movement herself, almost as if she knew how to open that door and step inside, like she'd learned how to use the key. On only her second such adventure, Eve felt like she was already an old hand, or an expert at this unusual and particular type of journey. She knew the way, and she knew what to do. From inside the Swan, gazing outwards again, she could see countless doorways to what she was certain were countless different and remote places in time. She could see the doorway that she had been drawn to before. It loomed quite large, was more prominent than most, perhaps only because she knew where it was and where it led. But this time there was another door that beckoned. There was another doorway that seemed to make itself more obvious than the rest, not far separated from the framed landscape that had served as her previous destination. With much more freedom of movement and what felt like more freedom of choice, she moved through the darkness towards the colourful scene that flickered inside. Flickered behind the doorway that presented itself as the place that she must go. Then, without even a pause or a thought of a pause, she stepped through. Eve's head was bowed and her eyes were fixed on the ground. Her still bare feet had stepped out onto smooth granite stones that had been metalled and fashioned into a sort of road or street. To her mild surprise, she was no longer dressed in the nightshirt that she had been wearing when she'd climbed out of bed, but instead seemed to be dressed in some form of old-fashioned clothes, a dress which was clean and starch stiff, but seemed very well worn, almost threadbare in places. Around her, flanking the stone and dirt streets, were old stone buildings, houses with thatched roofs and shuttered windows. The air felt like spring or even summer, and the sky was blue, with only a whisper of white clouds strewn across it. It took Eve a few moments to realise that she was not alone. In fact, there were lots of people about, mostly children. They didn't really seem to be paying any notice to her, which made her wonder why nobody else seemed to realise or be surprised or remark that she seemed to have appeared out of nowhere through a mysterious dark doorway from the future. She looked about her. Everybody seemed to be moving in one direction, down the slight incline of a hill, towards the point where one street seemed to crisscross with another, bigger roadway, equally built from smooth granite cobbles. Like a herd of sheep, they seemed to flow in one direction, towards the point where they disappeared around a corner. Checking her senses, Eve then realised that there seemed to be a strong smell of salty water, but more than that, the strong smell of fishiness, and she could hear the sound of seagulls, although there seemed to be none directly overhead. Instinctively, but motored on by free will, she joined and followed the flow of the gathering throng. She noticed how sprightly the other children skipped down the uneven cobbled ground, without paying any attention, with the blithe abandon and the dexterity of mountain goats. To move even a few steps without tumbling over, Eve had to keep her eyes, or at least half an eye, on where she was placing her feet. As she rounded the corner, Eve realised exactly where she was. She was standing at the top of Main Street, overlooking the harbour in Malin-Beg. There were no restaurants or bars, guest houses or shops, as there had been the last time she'd visited there with her parents, but the prominent stone harbour building at the bottom of Main Street announced in full voice exactly where Eve had landed. But the harbour building, which had been a derelict ruin when she last stood on Main Street, appeared as if it had only just been built. It seemed brand new. The heavy arched doors, which were themselves taller than the other buildings that surrounded it, were painted in a vivid dark green colour, and the paint seemed so fresh, clean and new that it still looked wet. The heavy shutters on the windows, painted the same colour, had exactly the same appearance. Up and down Main Street, there were one or two buildings that she did recognise. Like the old harbour building, they seemed to be brand new, albeit built in rough stone with thatched roofs like old cottages. But this was not the most dramatic difference. What startled Eve the most was how busy the harbour was. There must have been 100 fishing boats idling in the water, colourful fishing boats with large and small sails. And then there were the nets. It looked like there were hundreds and hundreds of miles of nets laid out on the harbour wall and down on the shale and pebble beach below. Eve stopped where she stood, causing people to part and move around her like water around a river rock. She surprised herself with her calmness to this point, but for a moment she became a little overwhelmed. The hairs on her neck and the backs of her arms stood up. She whispered to herself under her breath, "This is real. This is all real. How can this be happening?" After a brief moment of pause, she picked up the pace again and allowed herself to be carried along with the crowd, wherever it was going. "Be careful, Sinead. That's your church dress. If you can't lift it out of the dirt, then I'll send you off home." Eve immediately recognised the accent as an Irish one. The voice sounded rugged and hardy, but the tone, or the intention of the tone, was a gentle and well-meaning one. The voice was so close, coming from behind her, that Eve felt that it might have been directed at her. But less than a second after the mild scolding had drifted past Eve's ears, a girl, about her age, swivelled around and answered, "Mammy, hurry up, we're going to miss it." As she called out, her eyes dropped down and met with Eve's. She smiled a warm, full freckle-faced smile. This was the first acknowledgement that anybody else even realised that Eve was there. She had started to wonder whether she was invisible. Nothing was beyond belief at this point. Just moments later, the crowd started to slow to a stop. It looked as though the popular destination had been reached. Eve immediately registered where the group's pointed gaze was focused. They were looking at the building which Eve had known to be the dusty old antique shop on Main Street. But it wasn't an old antique shop now. It wasn't old at all. Once again, it was built in the old-fashioned style, but it looked sparkly and new. The whitewash was clean and fresh and a brilliant white, and the small window frames and the door were painted in a vibrant red. The gathering began to settle down to a hush, as if they were anticipating the arrival of the very thing that they had all been waiting for. As silence befell the group of 30 or so villagers, more children than adults, a man rose above the heads of everybody else, standing on a wooden crate in front of the red door. He was a young man of maybe 20 or 25, and he stood quite tall and upright. Compared to most of the gathered villagers, he seemed to be well dressed and clean and tidy. His hair was quite long and wavy, a jet black which contrasted and framed his bright green eyes so that his appearance was striking. While there was a smile on his face, there also seemed to be a hint of sadness in his eyes, Eve thought. He looked about the faces of the crowd for a few seconds. As he did, Eve was almost certain that he stopped for the briefest of moments when he had passed over her face, as if he recognised her. And then, as certain as she was that she had been recognised, she became certain that this must have been a trick of her own imagination. "The whole village must be here. I'm sure that he would feel very honoured. And so it is today that we have laid my father, Turtle, the first son of Macgiolla, into the ground, right at the very spot that he wanted to be buried, next to his own father on the bluff overlooking Turtle Cove. Most of you will remember my father as a curious man. He was just as curious to me, a native of these parts who spent very little of his life here, who seemed to always want a way. How could anybody even begin to come out from under the shadow of the great saviour of Malin Beg, Mac Jolla, my grandfather? Towards the end of his life, my father knew that his time was coming. He told me as much, but told me not to mourn, as there would be no death to his soul, just the casting away of his body. While I stand here on this day and honour the burial of this mortal vessel and the passing of his soul, it was with his last wish that we honour his father with this monument, the old Cole family home here in Malin Beg. I visited him daily over these last months while he sat in the off room and etched away with his drawings and writings. That he wished to tell the story of Mac Jolla and the saviour of our people, and he wished that we hang that tale upon the inner walls of this home, so that none who come to our place in the far future or from far away do naught but believe in it, in every detail and in every word. And he wished that we open the doors and give to you, for to cherish and sustain his legacy. At this moment, he stepped down from the crate and pushed open the heavy red door, walking inside as he did. Only a minute or so later, or what passed for a minute or so, and Eve was through the door herself with the first group of people. As she passed through into the inside, she noticed a small brass plaque on the wall. It was inscribed with the year 1850. Astonished as she was, she paused for a moment to take it all in. Context and every other thing of substance around her told her that the year inscribed on the plaque had just recently been inscribed, and that it told not of the year that the cottage was built or of any other year, but the year that her own 2 feet were standing squarely in. All these turtles, she whispered to herself as she passed into the interior. As the group gathered in the first room beyond the front door, they huddled together in the middle of the floor, or the ground, as it was, because the granite sets were no different inside from the ones outside. She cast her eyes around her. It was a little dark to see clearly at first, but rapidly enough her eyes began to adjust. Quickly she realised that it was mostly only the facade of the cottage which resembled closely the front of the old antique shop. While the antique shop had stretched back quite a way and had been adjoined by a number of rooms, this cottage was quite narrow from front to back and simply had one small doorway on either side of the room. "Manus?" questioned the voice of an older man, standing a few sets of shoulders over from Eve. "Are these his etchings and writings?" As he spoke, he motioned with his hand to the wall that the group were facing, but that the man, who Eve supposed must have been called Manus, had his back to. "They are, Mandy, they are." "Well then, I'd never, ever, for all of the wheat in Donegal, have believed that old man could read these words, let alone write them down like this. They're his words, Mandy, and they're his etchings. This is the story, as he was told it by his father, of that bleak day on the beach at Divine's Bay, when he was guided away from death during the starvation of Blaine on Air, more than 100 years ago. Well then, Manus, you'd better take us on that journey, because nobody else here can make a word from it." Without saying another word, Manus turned slowly around and looked at the first etching on the wall. He took a few moments to look it up and down, as though he had never seen it before, and was familiarising himself with it, although he definitely read it before, Eve thought. "I don't know how long my family have lived in this part of the world," he started. "Perhaps for as long as anybody else. Perhaps for the whole history of people. But I only know the names of my father's people from his telling. He was born in the year of Christ 1719, and had before him a living father and mother and a sister, who went about with the name Roisin. After him he had another sister and twin brothers. At least these were all the ones that lived long enough to walk away from the cradle. Famine brought the screaming shadow of death to Malin Beg, like it had the rest of Ireland. He pinched his spiny fingers together and shrugged away the skin of life. For 2 years, in 1740 and 1741, there had been no summer, and nothing would grow in the land of Donegal, or any place else in Ireland, or in the world known to us. On this day, a day of hard falling rain, hate-filled falling rain, and no light in the sky, Mac Jolla had left the village and was high on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. In the months before, while Malin Beg had buried more than half of their number, he had buried every living person that he'd cared for and who'd cared for him. And so he'd decided that this was to be the day that he would succumb to the avarice of death. He stared into those eyes of garnet and headed off towards Devine's Bay, not known then as Devine's Bay. He told me that he was not frightened of facing death. Fright was not the anguish that haunted his mind most. What haunted him and caused him to fear to sleep, what worried him awake, was the shame that might befall his corpse should he drop down and die on the stone and dirt streets that crisscrossed this settlement. He had put his loved ones beneath the ground all, and now there was none left with the strength or the inclination to see to the dignity of his remains. He was faced with the dread of having his disgraced mortal body taken apart by craven-hearted beasts that go about in the dark. He'd walked perhaps 2 hours or 3, not being sure of any solid ground, in search of a secret place where he could lie down and die. And so he found himself, after some time, standing on the sodden beach, looking at the cliffs for a cave or a place of seclusion, and looking at the sea. It was the sea that finally made her beckoning the loudest. He cursed this life. He cursed the moments even that led him to this beach, those wasted moments that would only, in the end, lead him into the waves, which could equally have consumed him in the harbour at Malin Beg. In these darkest moments, facing the end, he was overcome by an emotion that had long since deserted him. He felt angry. He was angry at death for chasing his Celtic people the length of Europe until they were left with no place to go or to stare but the ocean. He was angry at himself for having any kind of tilt at life at all, even angry at the people that had not yet been born, his own descendants, none already on the earth, and none would ever be born, but for whom he had already made accommodations in his heart. And then he fell away into the darkness. As Manus spoke, he seemed to be wholly consumed by the words that he was reading, the words of his father, written down in the last days, weeks and months of his own life, telling the story of Mac Jolla's very darkest moments. Eve was equally consumed as she followed him with the group from wall-hung etching to wall-hung etching. There was no way that Eve could think of that this Mac Jolla could ever escape his fate. Then, something very fleeting flashed through her mind. I don't know how long I had been lying on that wet beach, as time is a matter of consciousness, and my consciousness had departed me. Indeed, I felt that my life had departed. Manus was no longer speaking the words of his father Turtle, but the words written by his father of his grandfather. And then a moment came upon me where something stirred, and I felt that I might have been awakened. As Manus read these words very carefully, he paused and turned for a moment, looking at the group through the gloomy light of the interior of the narrow cottage. His eyes found exactly where Eve's eyes were, and he looked at her. It was unmistakable. He was looking at her. As he described this moment of awakening on the wet sands of Devine's Bay, Eve began an awakening of her own, a dawning. But this waking was not like any other waking moment that I had ever experienced. My memory was alive and coloured with all of the moments of my life, leading right up until the moment that I had collapsed on that sand. Manus continued, having slowly moved his eyes away from Eve's and back to the etching on the wall. The imprint of his wishes, he knew well, had been imprinted and had dawned the realisation fully in Eve's mind, for it seemed that he wished for her to know that he knew. I was there, she whispered under her breath. I was there. For the briefest time, Eve thought that she'd repeated those words out loud for everyone to hear, but a quick check on the people around her confirmed that the focus of their collective attention was still centered on Manus. My natural instinct was to open my eyes, but those eyes would not open. It was as though there was a weight forcing them shut. No matter how hard I pushed, how hard I tried, they would not open. I gulped hard and gave it another effort, to no avail. I figured around me with my senses and was struck hard by some realizations. While I felt myself to be awake, I could not hear a sound and I could not smell a smell. But I could feel the coarse sand pushing up into my face where gravity was pulling me down. I could then feel the light rain on my back and in my hair and down my neck, and I could feel the wind lifting my shirt away from my body and dropping it down again, but could still not open my eyes. In the telling of the tale, it seemed almost as though Manus was experiencing the events of his grandfather through the words of his father, and as Eve listened, her mind scrambled to make sense of what she was hearing, and she kept repeating the same words over and over again, sotto voce. I was there. I was there. I took a moment of composure, and as I did, I could feel my breathing lifting me and gently settling me, then lifting me and settling me again, then over and over. I focused all of my spirit and my energy to open those eyes until finally one of them loosed, and then the other, and I could see. What I saw, I will never forget. The whole world should never forget. For the sky before me, above the sea, seemed to be aflame. It was bright with yellow and orange and red flames. The sky seemed as though it was on fire, so that I felt at that moment that I had indeed passed out of this lifetime and was journeying to the next, as though I was answering God's call to time or following the devil while he dragged me away for a lifetime of sin and laziness. But as I squinted into the flames in the sky, I saw a figure appear before me. At first in the sky, descending through the blur and the brightness, as though the shape was made of flames itself. As that apparition descended down and seemed to land on the ocean, I could see that shape. I could see what she had become. She had become a glorious swan, who opened her wide, majestic wings and slowed down to a stop in the shallows, and then the flames died out. And as the flames died away, there was left a brightness wherein I saw the huge bird, a goddess, clear, as though her body was made of water or of cut and cultured glass. I closed my eyes and prepared my body and my mind for the coming, to be taken away to wherever the swan takes spirits when they depart, or perhaps be reunited with my beloved mother and my father, my sisters and my brothers, best friends all. But my breath continued, and moments passed, and more moments passed. As shorter moments passed on to become longer moments, I eventually heard the softest sound, like footprints in the sand. They came closer and closer until I felt that they were right before me, standing right in front of me. I dared open my eyes again to confront what was there to confront me. Then the most surprising thing happened. I felt a small and gentle hand on my cheek and then my forehead. These delicate fingers across my face nurtured my senses back into life. The sound of the seagulls filled the sky again, and the salty smell of the sea filled my nostrils. The weight from my eyelids was lifted, and so they opened. When I opened my eyes, I beheld the image of my salvation, the angel of my salvation. I beheld the most beautiful face that I had ever beheld, or would ever behold, the most perfect face, the face of a child. Around that face, the image of the goddess of the swan, there was this glorious light, a light from heaven that put my fears for the devil behind me. Now, as Manus spoke, Eve felt the rest of the room around her fall silent. She could only hear his voice, or the voice of Macjala, speaking through him, directly to her, and only her, about her. The angel didn't speak, as though she knew that I would not understand the language of heaven. Golden hair fell over her porcelain face, and the bluest, most captivating eyes looked down on me. My soul was calmed by the serene beauty before me. I knew that my worst travails were over, and that this pain and loss and suffering had come to an end, but that life had not come to an end. The angel stood straight up, with still a light behind her, like the sun was shining in glory over her shoulder. With ethereal poise, she started to walk up the bay towards the north, slowly. She stopped just a few steps away and looked back at me over her shoulder. I knew that she wanted me to follow her, and I know why she wanted me to follow, for she knew how close I was to my salvation and the salvation of the people of Malin Beg. I pulled myself to my feet, moving easier now, as if the hunger and the sickness were momentarily lifted from me. And I followed her, being careful not to stand in her footprints, for I felt them to be sacred. We reached the cliffs at the north end of the bay in just a short while, where they curve around to close off the beach. I don't remember that I had ever been right up to the cliff face at the north end, not at low tide in any event. Now, as we got right to the foot of the cliff, I noticed something that I had never seen before nor imagined. A small cave opening, which had previously seemed invisible, appeared. The opening, right at the water's edge, was just big enough for a set of shoulders to get through. The angel led the way, and I followed. After some twists and turns, trudging through the wet sand in almost complete darkness, a light opened up before me. Now the angel stood on a hidden beach, open to the sea, with jagged cliffs overhanging it. There was no way into this cove other than the secluded cave that I had just entered through, and no way of seeing the beach from any place other than the sea. This is the place that has since become known as Turtle Cove. The cove and the beach were a real surprise. The size was such a surprise, to find a place that had been hidden from human eyes forever. I had come to realise that I was there for a very particular reason. I waited and looked at the vision that had taken me to this place. Eve was hanging on every single word. She was certain that she had been the figure that had stepped out of the flaming sky on the beach that seemed to be known as Defiance Bay. But her memory of the event suggested that she had disappeared before MacJoll had awoken. She looked up at me and smiled, a divine smile. She looked down at her feet, and my eyes followed. With one of her feet she wiped away the sand from the top of a smooth and round object, or an oval, as it turned out. It seemed to be an egg. Then she caught my eyes again and cast them with hers right across the beach. I noticed immediately that the beach was covered with little mounds of sand, and I understood without explanation that each mound represented an egg. There were thousands upon thousands of them. Once again she smiled up at me, but this time the smile said something different. This time the smile said goodbye. Then there was a blinding flash that knocked me from my feet, and the angel disappeared. Once I had wiped the flash from my eyes, I got to my feet and looked about. There was no sign of the person that had been standing with me the moment before, but I knew that it had not been merely a vision, as her tiny footprints were still embedded in the sand. These, as the world knows, were turtles' eggs. Turtles to our forebears had always been sacred animals. Even my own grandparents had spoken about the annual harvest of turtles' eggs that would be laid and buried on some of the secluded beaches in these parts. But turtles had long since disappeared. Their nourishment and their medicinal gifts had long been taken away from us, by God or by a change in the ocean. Now I had discovered what seemed to be the last hiding, the last nesting place of the smooth giant turtles in these parts of Ireland. Never before had I beheld such a bounty, riches beyond what any conceived to be riches. This was the gift of life to me and all of Malin Beg. In just one eyeful I could see eggs that could feed 10 villages for as long as the great long starvation lasted. and the nesting cove that the turtles themselves would return to the following year, and no doubt the year after that, and again after that. I confess that I felt in that moment the sharpest sentiment of shame. I was undeserved of this reward. I was mindful of a sudden of all of the dead of my own family and beyond, and I began to sense that there would be a mourning. The shadow of my own death that had looked in at me from the near future was replaced by the shadow of the dead from the past. And I cried. I cried a heavier rain than any rain that has ever fallen in Ireland, and I wailed loudly and wildly. And I was broken down at that moment to the very smallest parts of my soul, and those fragments were scattered across the sand as the turtles' eggs were scattered. And with the gathering of each nourishing egg, I knew I would be rebuilt. As I rose from the place of my collapse to my knees, I saw something glinting in the light, resting on the sand, in the very spot where the angel had departed. It was a swan. It was the swan. For the next 20 minutes or so, Eve listened as Manus finished the remarkable story of Mac Giolla, how he'd returned to Malin 2 days after he'd left, bringing life with him rather than death, how he was nourished and healthy, and how he had discovered a secret that he did not want to keep a secret, how he led the villagers to the secret cove, and how they gathered the bounty together to take back to the village. Eve did notice that the swan and the angel were never mentioned again in the story of Mac Giolla or Malin, but how Mac Giolla became an influential man in the area and even the county, and became the father of Malin, how he then founded a new family estate on the bluff overlooking Turtle Cove. But her mind had become so full that it felt as though it was about to overflow. She found herself stroking the crystal swan in her pocket, wishing that it would take her home, so that she could begin the process of distilling the remarkable history that had been shown to her. As soon as she found herself back at the door of the cottage, she moved as if to make her way back to the side street where she'd landed. As she started off, she felt a hand on her shoulder, which stopped her suddenly. "Wee lady, we're making a memory over here. Would you oblige and stand for our photograph?" Then he winked at her, except he winked with both eyes, which is technically a blink. Chapter 6. Unfinished Business. The only question remaining when Eve woke up in her own bed the next morning was whether or not the whole business had come full circle. On the one hand, she felt that she had witnessed with her own eyes that she had awoken and led a dying man to a secluded cove that contained the means of his salvation, and that of his village, Malin. But on the other hand, this did not marry neatly with her own experience of the episode on the beach. It all felt a little unfinished. And then, as before, there was the creeping doubt about whether or not the whole thing had happened at all, or whether it had just been a very vivid, recurring dream, or rather than a recurring dream, a set of dreams that seemed to share and feed into the same narrative. It was a Saturday morning, and there was no school. Piano lessons had been cancelled, and the heavy falling rain outside afforded Eve the opportunity to hang around the house and do absolutely nothing that required the engagement of her mental faculties. It was an opportunity to decant and make sense of everything relating to the Crystal Swan. But a full Saturday and then a full Sunday, which collectively add up to a full weekend, still did not deliver the answers that Eve felt she needed. The principal question that Eve wanted to lay to rest was whether or not the whole affair had come to a conclusion, or whether or not there was something else that needed to be done. When bedtime rolled around on Sunday evening and the buttons of her brain box calculator seemed worn down, Eve came up with an idea. She needed some help, and Eve knew, as we all know, that best friends are the best place to go to get help. She hatched a plan. At lunchtime the next day in school, Eve sidled up next to Kira in the dinner hall. Kira, I've been working on a new adventure story. She waited for Kira's reaction. Wow, she replied. Can I help? This was precisely the answer that Eve had hoped for. So here's the thing, Eve began. She then proceeded to tell the whole tangled tale in the finest detail, being careful not to miss a single beat. Kira sat motionless and listened very carefully, widening her eyes with surprise and delight at all of the right moments. Clearly Eve put the whole narrative into the third person and changed some of the names, but the theme carried across perfectly. As it goes, retelling the story out loud to another person helped Eve to sort some of the puzzle pieces out herself, but the main questions still remained. Kira was blessed with a listener's intelligence. She understood the reason that she had been born with just one mouth and two ears, and so she sat patiently and listened to the whole story from start to finish without interrupting at all. Eve concluded by bringing Kira right up to date. She told her that the focus of the story, who Eve simply referred to as the little girl for the purposes of the telling, had stood motionless for what felt like an age to have her picture taken. She told her in vivid detail that the camera had been the size of a microwave oven. She coloured the landscape with smells, sights and sounds, and finally told her that the little girl had returned to the spot that had been her original landing place and immediately awoken in her bed, in her bedroom. At the finish, Eve looked into Kira's eyes and waited. Kira's eyes were wide in amazement. Eve, that's amazing. How does it end? This was an interesting but not unexpected answer. Interesting because Kira naturally assumed that the whole story was not finished, which was just the clarity from the outside looking in that Eve was seeking. How do you know it's not finished? She asked. It doesn't seem finished, came the answer in a casual tone. But why does it not seem finished? This prompted the listener's intelligence that Eve had sought, that had been the design of the plan that she'd hatched the night before. Okay, well, there are a few things that don't add up completely. Eve looked on expectantly. This MacJolla person was 20-something in 1741? Then how is his grandson only 20-something in 1850, 100 and a bit years later? So you might want to change some of the years. Clearly Eve wasn't in control of the years, as she was recounting something that had happened to her, rather than something that had manifested itself in her imagination. Possibly. This hadn't really registered with Eve. Also, she was quite surprised with the quick sums that Kira had just crunched in her head. But the reason that I didn't think the story was finished is because the little girl did not show the man on the beach where to go to find the turtle's eggs and save his own life and the lives of the people in the village. Kira looked at Eve, hoping that she had not insulted her. Maybe this little girl did show him the way to the secret turtle cove but couldn't remember doing it. This, in truth, had been the biggest question that Eve had wrestled with. But then Kira dropped all of the pieces into place. I thought of that, Kira responded, but that doesn't make sense to me. Even if you retold the middle bit of the story and had the little girl showing the dying man to Turtle Cove, how would she have known where it was? How would she know what nobody else knew, even the people that lived in that area at the time and had lived there for years? This was now all making sense to Eve. So I think the only way that the story makes sense is if the little girl returns through the swan one more time to the beach, wakes up the man and shows him to the cove. I think that would make everything fit. But I absolutely love the story. It's so brilliant. How do you come up with this stuff? Thanks, Kira. It just comes to me. But one more thing. How would the little girl in the story know where the secret cove is for the next time that she visited? That's easy, she answered with a beaming smile on her face. Even I know where to find Turtle Cove now. She just needs to travel to the northernmost cliff face in Devine's Bay at low tide and look for the cave mouth. That man Manus, reading his father's etchings, has told the girl as much. Otherwise, you'd kind of wonder what the second journey to the village was all about. if not to tell the little girl the way to save Mac Giolla and the rest of Malin Beg? Nothing else needed to be said. You're great, Kira. Thanks so much. That makes so much sense. I was wondering how it would finish. I mean, how I would write the ending. Eve longed to tell Kira the truth. The experience didn't feel fully experienced unless she was sharing it with someone, and it would be such a delight to share the experience with her best friend. But she knew that she wouldn't be believed. She sat back in her chair, pleased with Kira, but even more pleased with herself for hatching the plan and putting faith in the one person that she knew would probably solve the puzzle. With that, the decision was made. She wondered to herself if even the decision had required deciding. As the first 2 times that she'd ventured through the Crystal Swan, it had not been a conscious decision. She felt as though she had been summoned, and that summoning had been heralded both times by the strange tingling sensation that had nestled inside of her in the hours leading up to the beginning of each journey. But at 12:46, on Monday, the 16th of October, in the dinner hall at Cheadle Catholic, Eve made the positive decision that she was going to embark on one more journey to Malin Beg, to 1741, and be that angel of salvation that Mac Giolla had spoken of. At just that moment, at 12:46, just about to turn over into 12:47, on Monday the 16th of October in the dinner hall at Cheadle Catholic, whatever powers were at work smiled warmly in delight, enjoying the moment that Eve Coyle had embraced her fate in such a positive way. And then those powers decided that there was absolutely no need to hang about. That familiar tingling sensation that Eve had come to recognise set in immediately. Indeed, Eve kind of expected that it would, the moment that she had realised the sense in what Kira had said to her. There would likely be another happening that evening, at bedtime, and this time Eve was simply thrilled to be poised on the edge of the most remarkable chapter of her life to this point. Chapter 7. Closing the Circle. The sand between her toes was coarse, just as she'd remembered it. The rain falling from the sky was wet, equally as she'd remembered it. But this time, as she stood in Divine's Bay, knowing that it was called Divine's Bay, understanding why she was where she was, and where she was where she was, and when she was where she was, the whole scene looked infinitely more beautiful. She took a moment to take it all in. The cliffs no longer looked so foreboding. The ocean, while wild, didn't look nearly as angry as it had the last time that she'd been there. The bruised sky, as dark as it was, held a certain sullen charm. Now she turned her focus on the purpose of her visit, the man lying prone on the beach at the water's edge. She circled around between the man and the sea and stood looking down at him for a moment. Then she walked towards him, bent down and touched his face. This time she observed what she must have missed last time around. The man's face twitched slightly as if he'd awoken but dared not open his eyes yet. Eve knew almost precisely what to expect. She knew that as she touched his face, he would open his eyes. She knew that once he opened his eyes, he would see her standing in her nightdress, looking like divinity's gift, with the light of the sky behind her, framing her perfectly like the angel of his imagination. She knew that he would follow her to the north end of the bay, and then follow her to the cliff face, placing his footsteps with absolute care and precision so as not to disturb her footprints. She knew that he would follow as she passed through the cave that led to the cove beyond. Once in the embrace of the concealed beach, cradled on 3 sides by jagged rock, bounded by the sea and encased by the overhanging cliffs above, he would follow her prompts and discover the turtle's eggs, probably, to Eve's mind, numbering in the millions. Then, as surely as she'd appeared from thin air, she would disappear into the same thin air. And of course, this is precisely what happened. Eve's latest journey to the past through the fissures in time and space created by the Crystal Swan had been distinct from her previous experiences. This time, because she was almost following a set of instructions, it felt like a scripted performance. Real life experiences are never really truly scripted. Certainly, Eve's day-to-day existence followed patterns and routines, and she had come to understand what those routines looked like and broadly how those experiences would develop and how those developments might feel. But the regular chapters of her life still had a tendency to tumble along rather than march to a distinct or neatly choreographed beat. Travelling into the future at the speed of life necessarily involves travelling into the unknown. Naturally then, one's senses are sharpened, prepared for the unexpected. Sharpened senses organically make the highest resolution memories, the highest fidelity recordings of an experience. In other words, memories that actually feel like memories, rather than something less than memories, or at least different to, if not less than. But the beach at Divines Bay in 1741, the second time around, was not travelling into the unknown. She'd been there before, in that exact moment in space and time, and then listened to a detailed retelling of the events that she had not yet experienced. Experiencing scripted moments seemed to free her from the anxiety of those experiences. Being liberated from the responsibilities related to direction and drive, she had been able to look around a little more and enjoy the view, like a passenger, but not being the author of, or not feeling like the author of, the actual sequence of events that had seemingly saved the lives of more than just a handful of people, had the consequence of estranging Eve from the experience, or at least making the experience feel more remote. Much of this Eve did not fully comprehend, but this did not make the sensation less acute. Then there was the matter of expectation. Eve had expected to feel elated the very moment that she woke up in her room on her final return, but she wasn't, not really. She expected to enjoy the rewards of private personal accomplishment. She didn't know what that would feel like, but vaguely anticipated that it would feel something like happiness and pride. But what she had not considered, not for a moment, was that the whole experience was lacking a necessary and vital ingredient: validation. All of Eve's life she had become conditioned to react to positive encouragement from others, and praise and recognition for deeds well done. The phrase, virtue is its own reward, lacked substance in the mind of an 8-year-old girl, or at least in the mind of this 8-year-old girl. Certainly she was glad that she had embarked on such a remarkable journey, one which seemingly yielded such a positive outcome, but nothing in her immediate environment would materially change. Had anything actually changed, whether in her immediate environment or not? It only took a couple of hours on the morning of Tuesday the 17th of October for Eve's perspective on matters to shift and for questions to present themselves. Principal among those questions was a matter of what came first. As a born and consummate storyteller herself, Eve had become fascinated with timelines. The timeline made less and less sense to Eve the more she thought of it. She sketched a rough timeline on the back of her school notebook, considering the maxim of beginning, middle and end, and was dismayed to see that she had essentially drawn a circle. Inescapable now was the simple fact that Eve's introduction into the tale seemed to happen in the middle of the circle, not at the start, when she and the rest of her family had met a man called Turtle Coll, and then, the following day, another man with the same name. Generations of Coll men, called by the name Turtle, long before Eve had ever set foot in Malin Beg. The turtle shell that Vincent had knocked through the glass display case. The story about the discovery of a hidden but sustainable bounty of nourishment in the form of turtles and turtles' eggs. If Eve was the start of the journey, and if time made any sense at all, then turtles would not have appeared in Malin Beg in real form or scattered across as an inherited, almost honorary family name until she had led Mac Jolla to his salvation, as he called it. With this keystone removed, it was only a matter of time, and not a long time at that before the whole structure came crumbling in on Eve. The fabric of sense that she had built her beliefs on with regard to the mysteries of the Crystal Swan evolved in their appearance from common sense to nonsense. Once exposed to the cold, hard razor of rationale, it was all reduced to ribbons. Ribbons which could then be neatly tied in a bow by Eve's conditioned mind and presented back to her as a dream. All just a dream, were the first words that Eve said on Saturday, the 28th of October, as she was awoken by her brother Vincent. "What's just a dream?" he questioned. "You're just a dream, Vincent, or a nightmare. Leave me alone." As he sloped off down the stairs, Eve felt an immediate sense of guilt for the way that she had spoken to her little brother. "Sorry," she shouted down the stairs after him. For the first time since August, she stood up in her pyjamas and walked straight past her bookcase and down the stairs without even looking at the Swan. "Good morning, Grumpy," said her dad when he bumped into her on the middle landing. He'd noticed, as a few people had, that she had been a little gloomy of late. Eve half smiled and continued on down the next flight of stairs, heading for the kitchen. As she passed through the living room, she picked up her dressing gown from where she had thrown it the night before and threw it over her shoulders. Vincent had beaten her into the kitchen and was already perched on the best bar stool, the non-rickety one, and was fumbling with the remote. "Eve, can you make me some cereal, please?" Her mood was too flat to argue about the bar stool or even deny his request, as she knew what to expect when Vincent was faced with any form of rejection or confrontation. As she poured a bowl of cereal for both of them and retrieved some spoons from the cutlery drawer, she heard the unmistakable sound of the letterbox snap shut and some post hit the mat at the front door. Eve thought nothing of it. She flicked the TV on and passed the remote back to her brother so that he could find something to watch. To her, it would just be background noise anyway. As Eve's mum entered the room, she cracked the blinds open, one set at a time, as she passed through the room to flick the kettle on. "Good morning, sweetheart. I can see that we're going to have to work on that smile of yours today." Eve ignored her. Eve was lost in her own thoughts. Later, when she tried to remember what thoughts she had been lost in at the breakfast bar that morning, she could not recall. There was no reason, she would have thought, for her to be committing anything to memory. Life at that moment had simply and disappointingly returned to normal. Rather, it had never been anything other than normal or ordinary. She had just been the victim of her own extraordinary imagination. What Eve did remember later, in the days, weeks and months to come, is that these were the very last moments in Eve's young life that she would ever consider herself, her circumstances, her experiences, and most importantly, her fate, to be anything remotely resembling ordinary. "Oh, look at this," her dad called from the other room. "You've got some post." Eve briefly raised her eyes up from her cereal bowl to look at her mother. "No, Eve," her dad corrected. He was now standing next to her. "You've got post." Eve's eyebrows raised momentarily until reason suggested that this was probably a straggling birthday card that had been lost in the mail or lost before it reached the mail inside someone's forgetful memory. It did in fact look like the envelope of a birthday card. "It's got an Irish stamp on it, and it's postmarked Donegal," her dad offered. Clearly, it was from Auntie Nora or Josie, Eve concluded, as she took the envelope in her hand, now a little more positive at the prospect of a €10 or €20 note dropping out of the card. "Open it, then." Her mother was only halfway through mouthing the words before Eve began tearing into the envelope. What emerged from the envelope was not a birthday card at all. Surprisingly enough, it was a postcard. At first blush, the glossy side, the picture side, seemed to be one of a grainy old sepia photograph, like some of the postcards that you sometimes find on the twirly racks outside post offices and novelty shops at holiday resorts. Except this wasn't that, or at least this wasn't just that. This was more than that, much more than that, and Eve understood exactly what it was almost immediately. The old photograph had a dozen or so people standing in two lines, with children at the front and adults at the back. They were standing in stiff and regimented lines with non-smiling poses in front of an old cottage with a thatched roof. Unremarkable, perhaps, to most eyes, but not to Eve's eyes. As she scanned the faces, slowly moving left to right, there was a spark of recognition for each. She'd seen them all before. But none of these faces were nearly as recognisable as the last face on the right, standing in the front row. That face, the most recognisable face of all, staring out at Eve across almost 170 years of history, was the very same face that greeted her every morning when she looked in the mirror. As Eve read the words on the other side of the card, she felt a familiar but unusual sensation of butterflies taking flight inside her stomach. When you're measuring a circle, Eve, it doesn't matter where you start.